On a recent trip to France, I had a layover in New York City and I thought, you know what, I should be reviewing some sort of camera. So I stopped by B&H and I picked up the SONY A9. This is supposed to be the DSLR killer. And all my photography friends are telling me I'm crazy for shooting with the Nikon D850 because this Sony is that much better.
And so for this week, I'm actually going to be putting that to the test. I'm going to be exclusively using this camera as I travel throughout France and New York. And let's see if I'm willing to give up my Nikon D850 to move over to Sony.
There's no doubt the Sony A9 is well built, but there's one thing I noticed right away.
Now, I have big hands just like our president, Donald Trump.
Look at those hands. Are they small hands?
And when I grip this thing, it's not a large enough grip for me to comfortably get all of my fingers around the front of it, and my pinky finger kind of hangs off the bottom. Now, I really appreciate how thin this camera is. I love the fact that it doesn't have a mirror and this takes up less space in my camera bag. I just wish that they had made the grip slightly larger, and if they had, it would also fit a larger battery. But for me and my large hands, it's not ideal.
Now, there's a very good chance that the majority of people watching this video have never tested out a professional mirrorless camera before. Let me quickly compare this to a standard DSLR.
Because there's no mirror, when you look through the viewfinder, if the camera's off, you're not able to look through the lens. Instead, what you're looking through is a digital viewfinder. It's actually replicating exactly what you see on the back of the screen. Now, one of the benefits is that you can actually see the exposure right on the screen or in the viewfinder. So if it's overexposed, it's just going to look pure white, and if it's underexposed, it's going to look pure black. Now, this works in theory, but I've got to tell you, the screen inside the viewfinder is not quite as good as I expected it to be, and it kind of always appears a little blown out in my opinion. So even though I should be able to get a correct exposure without looking at the meter, I find myself looking at the meter most of the time anyway. Now, because the viewfinder is really just replicating the screen that's right below it, I also find myself shooting with just the screen most of the time. And that's kind of strange to me because as a professional photographer, I would never shoot with live view normally.
And that's because on a standard DSLR, if you're shooting in live view, you're going to lose some features. Particularly, you're going to lose fast and accurate autofocus. But when you're shooting with a mirrorless camera, you can use the digital screen on the back or the digital viewfinder, and you're going to get the exact same results.
One other interesting feature of a digital viewfinder is that you can also review your images in the viewfinder. That's something that you'd never be able to do with a standard DSLR. So choosing between a digital viewfinder or a standard optical viewfinder really just comes down to personal preference these days.
As I was walking through Paris, I was able to snap photos and video clips, and I was a little upset to see that if you shoot in 4K, it will punch in, meaning that it only uses the center portion of the sensor to record 4K footage. This does not happen if you shoot 1080, so if you're looking for a camera just to shoot video with, this probably isn't your best option. But keep in mind, most people are not buying this as a video camera. They're buying this because this is supposed to be one of the best sports cameras ever made. Now, during my trip, I did not have any sports to shoot, but I did have the next best thing. I was invited as a guest to a wedding, so I brought the camera along, and I was really excited to try out two main features. One was totally silent shooting, which is a digital shutter, which this camera does incredibly well. I was able to shoot totally silently, no sound whatsoever, and the camera does not suffer from rolling shutter issues like my Nikon D850, which also has a silent shooting mode, but really cannot be compared at all. The Sony A9 is much better. The other thing that I wanted to test out was autofocus, and I found that the A9 had excellent autofocus, but at the same time, it wasn't significantly better than my Nikon D850. It felt very comparable. Now, autofocus while I was recording video was fantastic. This is the best camera I've ever tested in that sense, much better than my D850 or my Panasonic GH5, so I was really excited about that. I also shot all of these clips in 120 frames per second in 1080, and I think they look great.
Now, a few years ago was the last time I picked up a professional Sony camera, and one of my biggest complaints was the battery life. Those cameras back then would die so quickly, especially if I was shooting video. I'm happy to say that Sony has stepped up their game a little bit with this camera, but just keep in mind that mirrorless cameras in general consume much more battery power than a standard DSLR, because when they're on, they're constantly rolling. That sensor is constantly recording and outputting the signal either to the screen on the back or the digital viewfinder.
So I don't think any mirrorless camera is going to beat a DSLR when it comes to battery life, but Sony has done a great job with the A9. So we are currently doing a 4-mile hike across this mud and sand at low tide to get to this island out here. But this is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. This looks like a matte painting out of some movie. The hike to Mont Saint-Michel was one of the coolest things I've ever done, and I brought the Sony along with me. Now, the night before, I had finished shooting the wedding, and I just decided to leave the camera in silent shooting mode. It's actually kind of nice to have a totally quiet camera. On the walk up, I was able to get more pictures and some video clips of my entire crew walking. It was such a memorable experience. Now, even though this is a mirrorless camera, it's still pretty heavy, especially with a 24-70 2.8 lens, and I don't usually like to travel around on vacation with big, bulky cameras because I'm usually just shooting snapshots. I'm not trying to create art prints, or I'm not trying to sell this work. You're not gonna get any professional print-worthy pictures unless you're here waiting for the perfect time of day. So although I got some cool pictures, I would have been just as happy to shoot them on my iPhone. But of course, the Sony performed really well, as it should for a $7,000 camera system. At this point, we were all wrapped up with our trip to France and it was time to head back home. But before we did, we decided to stop off in New York City.
So we made it back to the States. It was an awesome trip, but to use the A9 as a vacation camera doesn't really make much sense. This is really for sports shooters and very specialized professional photographers, and I was kind of just walking around taking snapshots with it most of the time. So before I end this review, I want to put this camera through one real-world test. We're currently in New Jersey, and in just a few minutes, we're gonna be going up in a helicopter, and we're gonna be shooting Manhattan at dusk. I wanna be able to put this camera to the test when it comes to high frame rate shooting and low light image quality, as well as low light autofocusing. Let's see how it works.
Now, I was told that because of the wind and the vibration, I wanted to stay at least around 1/250th of a second. So that put me at f2.8, and then I changed my ISO from around 1600 and I went all the way up to 6400 when it started to get a little bit darker. Now, because I was worried about vibration, I turned the camera into high-speed shooting mode, and I got to test out one of the most impressive features, and that is a no blackout shooting up to 20 frames per second. And if you've shot with a DSLR, you know each time you take a picture, it blacks out because the mirror is having to pop up and down. And if you shoot with most mirrorless cameras, they do the same thing. The screen will turn off for a second. Well, not with the Sony A9. You can just hold the shutter down and there's a little box around the screen that will flicker, but the screen itself will stay on throughout the entire shooting, even if you're shooting at 20 frames per second, which makes it much easier to see what you're taking pictures of and make sure that you're getting everything in focus. Now, I personally almost never shoot rapid fire like this, but if you do, this feature alone might be worth buying this camera for. So then after almost 2 weeks with this camera, what are my final conclusions? Honestly, if you're the type of person who needs to shoot professional images with a completely silent camera, for example, if you're shooting on a movie set, go out today and buy the Sony A9. I have never tested a camera that was able to shoot this well completely silently. But when we start looking at the other features of the camera, it's pretty comparable to the other Nikon and Canon cameras that I've tested. The autofocus was great, but it wasn't abnormally better than other cameras I've tested. Image quality was awesome as well, but again, very similar to other cameras. When you shoot in 4K, it punches in and doesn't use the entire frame. Battery life is not going to be quite as good as a DSLR. And then of course the big one for me, it just wasn't that comfortable for me to hold all day long. So for all of those reasons, I'm not gonna be switching over to the Sony system anytime soon, but there's one other thing that I wanted to mention. When I was shooting this in silent mode at the wedding, I got really excited for wedding photographers because I've always wanted a camera that could shoot professionally and be 100% quiet.
But when I got home, I was talking to somebody about it, and he reminded me that you can't sync a flash when the camera is in digital shutter mode because it's not a global shutter. We're not there quite yet with the technology. So you would constantly be having to switch back and forth from regular shutter to digital shutter mode, whether you wanted to shoot silently or with a flash. So it's just not quite as convenient as all wedding photographers wish it could be. Now, all that being said, Sony has come such a long way, and I completely understand why people are moving over to this ecosystem. This is an unbelievable camera. And if you already don't own a Nikon or Canon camera and you don't own thousands of dollars in lenses, definitely test out a Sony camera before you make the jump into one of those other brands, because this is definitely, at the very least, an equivalent choice. For more information just like this, head over to fstoppers.com for daily free content. And if you'd like to check out our full-length photography tutorials, head over to fstoppers.com/store.